It was an ordinary day at the high school where he worked, a day that blended into all the others. The halls echoed with the sound of students chatting, lockers slamming, and the shuffle of shoes on the linoleum floors. The building, though older and worn, was a second home to him. He had worked here for years, mostly unnoticed, but that was just the way he liked it. He didn't mind being invisible. It made his job as a custodian easier. His life was simple, straightforward. He woke up early every morning, made his daughter breakfast, and dropped her off at school before heading to his own job. His daughter was the light of his life, and everything he did revolved around making sure she was okay. Her mother had passed away a few years ago, and since then, he had been doing his best to raise her on his own. There wasn't a lot of time. For himself, his days were filled with cleaning, fixing things around the school, and making sure his daughter had a good life. At the school, he had a routine. He cleaned the classrooms after the students left, wiped down the hallways, mopped the floors, and made sure everything was in order for the next day. Most of the staff didn't think much about him beyond that. The teachers and administrators were busy with their own work. The students rarely took notice. He didn't mind. He had never been one for attention. The only one who truly seemed to see him for who he was, outside of his job, was the principal. But even she, though friendly, didn't know much about his personal life. The principal was strict, no nonsense, but not unkind. She knew he did his work well, and had always appreciated his quiet reliability. They didn't speak much beyond basic pleasantries. He liked it that way. She had a lot on her plate, running a school full of teenagers, and he understood that. But even in his quiet, predictable world, there were moments of surprise. One such moment came during a casual staff meeting one afternoon. It was the usual gathering of teachers, administrators, and staff, sitting in the break room discussing school matters. The meeting was nothing special, mostly just updates on upcoming events and discussions about the state of the school. But as the meeting came to a close, something unexpected happened. A few of the teachers were chatting about how they could never get a break from the sound of music coming from the music room. The music teacher had a habit of practicing or letting students play during free periods, and the sound often echoed through the halls. It wasn't loud enough to be a nuisance, but it was a constant presence. One teacher joked, "I swear, I can't walk down this hallway without hearing something coming from that piano. It's like a concert every day." Another teacher laughed, "Maybe we should start asking Jim to play for us. He's always cleaning around here. Maybe he's hiding some musical talent." The comment was lighthearted, a joke among colleagues who had no real idea about his life outside of his custodial duties. The teachers had no idea that he had grown up playing the piano, learning it from his mother, who had been a musician. But that part of his life had been tucked away for years. He never brought it up, never felt the need to share it with anyone. His world had become so focused on his daughter and his job that the music seemed distant, like something from a different life. But as the teachers laughed, the principal, sitting at the head of the table, leaned forward with a smile. She was known for her stern demeanor, but there was always a wry sense of humor under her professional exterior. She caught his eye and said, "Well, if you're such a piano master, Jim, why don't you show us what you've got? Maybe next time we have a staff meeting, you can play for us." The room fell silent for a moment. The teachers, realizing what had been said, turned toward him. He wasn't sure what to do. It was all said in good fun, but the idea of playing in front of everyone made him nervous. It wasn't something he had ever done, not in years. His fingers hesitated as he looked around the room. But then he smiled and nodded, trying to brush it off. "Sure," he said with a chuckle. "Maybe next time." The others laughed, and the conversation moved on, but for some reason, the idea stuck with him. He had said it jokingly, but the challenge hung in the air. He had always been shy about his musical ability, afraid that if people saw it, they might expect something from him. It was easier to keep it hidden, to be the quiet custodian who did his job and kept to himself. But now the suggestion was out there, and he couldn't shake it. The rest of the day went by, and he went back to his usual routine. He swept the halls, scrubbed the restrooms, emptied the trash cans. But every so often, his mind wandered back to the piano in the music room. He hadn't played in so long. His mother's old piano, the one she used to play when he was a boy, was still at the house, but it had become more of a decoration than an instrument. He had never had the time or the energy to sit down and play. His life had changed so much since she had passed, and music had become just another memory. That night, after dropping his daughter off at her grandmother's house, he found himself walking by the music room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see the grand piano inside. He stood there for a moment, just staring at it. The sound of the piano had always brought him comfort, but it felt like a lifetime since he had touched one. He stepped inside. The room, the smell of polished wood and old sheet music filling the air. The piano sat in the center, its keys waiting. Without thinking, he walked over and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain at first. But then, almost without realizing it, they began to move. The melody came back to him, as natural, as breathing. It had been years, but the music was still there, locked in his hands. He played quietly at first, just a simple tune, the kind of music that brought him peace. It was a song he had learned as a child, one his mother had taught him. The music filled the room, and for a brief moment, it felt like he was back in another time, back when his life wasn't so complicated. He played for about an hour, losing himself in the melody. It felt good to play again. It felt good to feel something other than the weight of his responsibilities as he finished the piece. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the keys. He had forgotten how much he loved it, how much the music meant to him. But the reality of his life came rushing back, and he stood up, gave the piano one last look, and left the room, quietly closing the door behind him. No one had seen him play. No one would know. It was just a small secret he could hold on to, a part of himself he didn't have to share with anyone. But little did he know, that moment, quiet and unnoticed as it was about to change everything. The next week, the incident at the staff meeting seemed to have faded into the background. No one brought up the piano again, and life at the school continued as usual. He fell back into his routine, cleaning the classrooms and hallways, taking care of the same tasks he had done for years. His mind, however, kept returning to the piano. Even as he worked, the thought of playing again lingered in the back of his mind, but he tried to push it away. He wasn't one for attention, and the idea of performing in front of anyone, especially his colleagues, still made him uneasy. But then, one morning, just a few days after the staff meeting, it happened. He was walking down the hall after finishing his work in the gym when he heard a familiar voice. It was the music teacher, talking to some of the other staff members by the water cooler. They were laughing, chatting about the upcoming school event, and as he passed by, he overheard her say something that made him stop in his tracks. "Have you guys heard about Jim? He's a secret piano prodigy. I'm telling you, he should perform at the next school event." The other teachers laughed, thinking it was a joke, but the music teacher seemed serious. "No, really. He was cleaning the music room the other day, and I heard him play. The guy's amazing. I couldn't believe it. He's got this beautiful, soulful touch." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized that anyone had been listening. He'd played so quietly, assuming no one would notice. And yet, here they were, talking about it. It wasn't meant to be a performance, it was. Just him, letting his fingers move on their own, lost in the music. But somehow it had caught their attention. The conversation didn't last long, but it left him with a strange feeling. Part of him wanted to run and hide, to pretend it never happened. But another part, the part that had missed playing so much, felt something stir inside him. Maybe he didn't have to hide it. Maybe, just once, it wouldn't be so bad to share it. He didn't bring it up again, but the thought lingered throughout the day. By the time he went home, he found himself thinking more and more about the piano. The idea of playing in front of others didn't seem so terrifying anymore. He knew he had the skill, but it wasn't about that. It was about being seen, about showing a side of himself that no one had ever really noticed before. The next morning, as he started his shift, the idea of the piano still hung in the air like an unspoken promise. He went through his usual tasks, cleaning, mopping, wiping, down the tables, but the whole time he felt the pull of the music room. After lunch, with most of the students in class and the hallways quieter than usual, he found himself standing outside the music room again. It was tempting. The door was cracked open, and he could hear the faint sound of a student playing scales inside. He stood there for a moment, just listening. The sound of the piano, the way it filled the space with its resonance, was calming. It made him think of his mother, who used to sit by the piano and play songs with such ease. Her music had always been a comfort, a reminder that no matter how hard things got, there was always a way to find peace. He stepped inside the room and sat at the piano again, just like he had the week before. But this time, there was a small spark of excitement. It wasn't just about cleaning anymore. It was about something more. He didn't start playing immediately. He sat there for a moment, letting the quiet wash over him. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. It was a song his mother had taught him when he was young. The first song he'd ever learned, a simple melody that he hadn't played in years. As his fingers moved over the keys, the music felt different. It wasn't just a song, it was a story. His story. A memory of a time when things felt easier. When he was a kid and music had been his escape. He played with more emotion this time, letting the music speak for itself. For the first time in a long time, he felt something. He felt connected to that part of himself that he had kept hidden. He wasn't just a custodian anymore. He wasn't just a father. He was a person with a history, with something beautiful to share. It wasn't a long performance, but it was enough to remind him of the joy music had brought him. The music filled the room, echoing off the walls, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. There was no one else in the world, except for him and the piano. As he finished, he sat there for a while, letting the silence settle in. He felt both at peace and a little unsettled. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to feel anything other than exhaustion and responsibility. But the music reminded him that there was more to life than just going through the motions. There was beauty in the small moments, in the things that people didn't always notice. He stood up and quietly closed the door behind him. His heart was racing, but not with fear. It was excitement, maybe even hope. Maybe it wasn't so scary to share that part of himself after all. But he didn't think about it too much. He had a job to do, and his daughter would be home soon. He couldn't afford to get lost in thoughts about piano performances. Life moved on, and he needed to keep up, but as the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe it wasn't just the piano. It was the idea that people could see him for more than just the man who cleaned up after everyone else. He wasn't sure what it meant, but it was something to think about. That afternoon, when the staff gathered for their usual break, the conversation came up again. This time, it wasn't just the music teacher talking. The other staff members joined in, casually mentioning how they had heard about his playing, "You really should perform at the next school event," one of the teachers said. "You've got a gift. It'd be such a hit." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected it to be brought up again, but here it was. The joke had turned into something real. The others were looking at him expectantly, waiting for his response. He felt his face heat up with embarrassment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to say yes, but he also didn't want to brush it off again. So, with a small smile, he said, "I'll think about it." The group nodded, satisfied, but inside, he was still unsure. What if he couldn't do it? What if he froze, forgot everything, and embarrassed himself? But then again, what if it was worth it? What if sharing this part of himself was just what he needed? He didn't have the answer yet, but one thing was clear. The idea of playing, of being seen for something other than his job, was starting to take root. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The days that followed were a blur of work and routine, but every so often, the thought of the upcoming staff event crept into his mind. The joke about performing hadn't been forgotten, and he couldn't ignore how the conversation had shifted from casual teasing to something more serious. People were actually expecting him to play, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was unsure of what to do. He wasn't scared of the piano. It was the one thing in his life that had always made sense. But performing in front of others, especially in front of his colleagues, felt different. He wasn't sure he could handle the attention. He had never been one to put himself in the spotlight. But now, the idea of stepping up and playing was there, hanging over him like a question he didn't have an answer to yet. It was late one afternoon when he decided to take a step, even if it was small. He had just finished his cleaning duties and found himself standing outside the music room again. The door was ajar, and the quiet hum of the piano echoed from inside. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision he was facing. Inside the room, the piano sat just as it always had, waiting. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to back out, not now. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, the only sound the gentle hum of the school outside. He sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys, feeling the familiar coolness of the ivory beneath his fingers. The last time he played, it had been just for himself. But today, as his fingers moved, he knew that this was different. He had been asked to play, and in some strange way, the weight of that request felt like a challenge he couldn't avoid. He began with a simple melody, something calm and quiet, just to settle himself. The music flowed easily, and he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was just him and the piano, no one else to worry about. But the longer he played, the more. His nerves began to settle, and he realized that he was starting to enjoy the music again. He hadn't felt this way in years. The song he played wasn't particularly complicated, but it carried an emotion he couldn't quite describe. He felt the memories of his past, the music, his mother, the joy it had brought him, all come rushing back. It was as if the piano was a bridge between his present and his past, a way to reconnect with the person he used to be, the person he had forgotten about while dealing with the daily responsibilities of life. He let the music guide him, letting his hands move more freely. He didn't think about the staff or the event anymore. He just played. For a moment, he wasn't a custodian, a single parent, or a person weighed down by the world. He was just someone lost in the music, allowing the notes to speak for him. But as he finished, he was left with a quiet sense of pride. He had pushed through the uncertainty, and in the process, he had rediscovered something important. Music had always been a part of him, something he had buried for too long. Now, it felt like it was finally coming to the surface again. He stood up from the piano and quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't know yet if he was ready to perform, but for the first time, he felt like he had something worth sharing. The idea of playing in front of others didn't seem so terrifying anymore. He had a chance to show them a side of himself they didn't know existed. The next day, he returned to work as usual. The school was busier than normal, with preparations for the staff event taking place. There were decorations to hang, food to organize, and last-minute details to attend to. As he walked down the hall, he could hear the chatter of teachers and students preparing for the event. The atmosphere was lively, but he felt a strange calmness inside him. It wasn't until he passed by the music room that his thoughts shifted back to the piano. The door was open again, and for a brief moment, he thought about walking in, but he stopped himself. He wasn't ready to play just yet, not in front of everyone. The idea of performing still made him nervous, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. The music was a part of him, and if he didn't step up now, he might never have the chance again. That evening, as the event began and the staff gathered in the hall, he found himself standing near the back of the room. People were talking, laughing, and enjoying the food and music. He was content just watching, blending into the background as he always did. But then, someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was the principal. She smiled at him, her usual stern expression softened by a knowing look. "Ready to play?" she asked, her voice calm but encouraging. He froze for a moment. His heart raced. This was it. He had been asked, and now it was time to decide whether or not he would follow through. He nodded slowly. "I'll play," he said, more to himself than to her. His voice sounded unsure, but there was no turning back now. The principal smiled and patted him on the back. "Good. I think everyone's excited to hear you." He followed her to the small stage at the front of the room. The piano was set up, and the crowd had begun to settle into their seats. His palms were sweaty as he approached the piano, but he tried to steady himself. It was too late to back out now. As he sat down at the piano, the room fell silent. He felt every pair of eyes on him, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he tried to focus on the keys in front of him. This was his moment. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just the custodian. He wasn't just a single parent trying to get through the day. He was a person with a gift to share. He took a deep breath and began to play. The music was slow at first, just like before, a simple melody that filled the room with its soft warmth. He let the notes float through the air, not rushing, just letting the music breathe. He felt the tension begin to ease as the sound of the piano washed over him. The nerves faded, replaced by the familiar comfort of the keys beneath his fingers. As the piece continued, he played with more confidence, allowing his emotions to guide the music. The audience sat in rapt attention, listening quietly. He could feel their eyes on him, but it didn't bother him anymore. This was his time to share something real, something personal. The music was the bridge between him and them, a way to communicate without words. When he finished, there was a long silence in the room. For a moment, he wasn't sure if anyone would react. But then, one of the teachers clapped, followed by another, and soon the entire room erupted into applause. He felt his face flush with embarrassment, but there was a smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't expected that response, but it was real. People had listened, and they had appreciated what he had shared. The principal walked over to him, her face beaming with pride. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "You've got a real gift." He nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. He had played. He had shared something of himself, and it had been enough. More than enough. As he stepped off the stage and joined the crowd, he realized something important. It wasn't about being perfect or having the best performance. It was about being true to himself. And in that moment, he had done just that. The days after the staff event felt like a dream. The applause, the smiles, the surprised looks on the faces of his colleagues. It was all so much more than he had expected. He hadn't thought his performance would be a big deal, just a small moment for himself, something to get out of the way. But instead, it had been the opposite. It had been a reminder that there was more to him than the job he did every day, more than the life he'd built around his responsibilities. The music teacher, who had been one of the loudest supporters of his performance, stopped him the next day as he was cleaning the hallway. She was smiling, her eyes sparkling. "I still can't believe how incredible you are," she said, almost in disbelief. "I think you have the potential to do so much more with that talent. You should play in front of a larger audience, you know." Her words caught him off guard. He hadn't even considered the idea of playing outside of the school's small circle. It was a fleeting moment, something that hadn't felt like a big deal at all. But now, with her enthusiasm, the idea seemed to grow larger. Could he really do that? Play for a bigger crowd? What if he wasn't good enough? What if people didn't like it? But she wasn't the only one who had been impressed. After the event, a few other teachers approached him, telling him how moving his performance had been. One of the history teachers even suggested that he should perform at the next school assembly. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. It was one thing to play in front of his colleagues, who already knew him in some way. But to stand in front of a room full of students, people who didn't know him and didn't expect anything from him, well, that felt like a different kind of pressure. His first instinct was to dismiss the idea. He had been a custodian for years, a quiet presence in the background. He was good at keeping things running smoothly, but he wasn't meant to be the center of attention. But there was something about the way the teachers spoke to him, the genuine appreciation they showed, that made him start thinking. Maybe there was more to his music than he realized. Maybe it wasn't just something he kept to himself anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it was something worth sharing. Over the next week, the thought of performing again started to feel less like a burden and more like an opportunity. He'd spent so many years pushing his dreams to the side, telling himself there wasn't time for things like music. But now, the possibility of combining his life, his job, his responsibilities, his love for music, was beginning to feel more natural. It wasn't just a pipe dream anymore. It was a chance to step outside the life he had built, to show people a side of him they hadn't seen before. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his daughter had never seen him perform. She knew him as the man who worked hard every day to take care of her, the one who made sure she had everything she needed. But she had never seen the other side of him, the side that had once been passionate about music, the side that had once dreamed of more. He wasn't sure why, but the idea of her seeing him play made him feel both nervous and excited. He talked to her one evening after dinner. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, working on a school project, when he brought it up. "I'm thinking about playing at the school assembly," he told her, unsure of how she would react. She looked up from her work, her eyes lighting up. "Really? That sounds awesome. You're going to play the piano, right?" He nodded, a little surprised by her enthusiasm. "Yeah, I guess so." "You have to do it," she said, her voice full of confidence. "I've never seen you play in front of anyone before. I think it'd be amazing. Plus, you're really good." His heart swelled with pride. He had never expected her to be so supportive, but hearing her words made something inside him shift. She believed in him, and maybe that was enough. Maybe? He didn't have to question whether or not he was good enough. He just had to believe in himself, the way she did. The next day, he went to work with a new sense of purpose. The thought of performing still made his stomach churn, but it was different now. He wasn't just playing for a crowd or to prove something. He was playing because he had something to share, something real, something he had kept hidden for so long. It wasn't just about the music. It was about being true to himself, about showing his daughter and his colleagues that there was more to him than what they saw. He spent the next few days practicing. He went to the music room every chance he got, letting the familiar sound of the piano guide him. He played pieces he hadn't touched in years, feeling the weight of each note as he rediscovered the joy he had once felt. It was harder than he remembered. His hands weren't as quick as they used to be, and his fingers stumbled over some of the more difficult parts. But it didn't matter. He kept playing, even when it felt imperfect. Music had always been a refuge. For him, and this time, it felt like a lifeline. As the day of the assembly drew closer, his nerves began to creep back in. He knew he had to make a choice. The teachers had already been talking about his performance, and they were excited to see what he would play. He had been given a chance, and he didn't want to let it slip away. But the idea of standing in front of a room full of students, many of whom he had never even spoken to, made his stomach churn. What if they didn't like it? What if they laughed or made fun of him? He tried to push those thoughts away. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for himself and for his daughter. He wanted to show her that it was okay to be scared, but it was even more important to face that fear head on. The morning of the assembly, he found himself walking to the music room with a sense of calm he hadn't expected. He still felt nervous, but it wasn't the same kind of fear he had felt before. It was more of an excitement, a desire to share something important. When he stepped into the music room, the teachers were already there, setting up for the event. The piano was positioned at the front, the spotlight softly shining on it. He took a deep breath and sat down at the bench. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, and then he began to play. The first few notes were shaky, but as the music settled into his hands, it became easier. His body relaxed, and the music flowed out of him naturally. He didn't think about the audience, about the students or the teachers watching him. He just played. He played for himself, for the memory of his mother, for the years he had spent hiding this part of himself. The melody was simple, but it was powerful, and for a moment, the rest of the world fell away. It was just him and the music, and that was enough. When the final note rang out, there was a pause, just a beat of silence. Then the room erupted into applause. He looked up, surprised but grateful. The students had been watching him, and their response was overwhelming. They weren't laughing. They weren't judging. They were simply listening, and in that moment, he realized something important. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. What mattered was that he had taken the chance, that he had played Dot as he stepped away from the piano. He caught sight of his daughter in the back of the room, her eyes wide with pride. She gave him a thumbs up, and he smiled. In that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. This wasn't about being perfect. It was about being brave enough to show up, to share a part of himself that he had kept hidden for so long. And as the applause continued, he realized that he was no longer just the custodian. He was someone who had something to offer, something beautiful, something real. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to embrace it. After the assembly, life at the school seemed to take on a different rhythm. The ordinary days felt brighter somehow, and there was a new kind of respect in the hallways. It wasn't that anyone was treating him differently, at least, not in a way that was obvious, but something had shifted. He could feel it in the way the teachers greeted him, in the way his colleagues spoke to him, and in the way his daughter's eyes lit up when she saw him at the end of the school day. She had always been proud of him, but now there was something more. There was a new layer of connection between them, one built on the shared experience of him stepping out of his comfort zone. He had always been there for her, always made sure she had everything she needed. But seeing him take a risk, seeing him face his fears and put himself out there, gave her a new understanding of him. It wasn't just about being the provider anymore. It was about showing her that it was okay to take chances, to fail, and to grow. It was about teaching her that it was okay to be afraid, but also it was okay to move forward in spite of that fear at home. He began spending more time with her, making sure their evenings weren't just about homework and dinner. They started taking walks together after school, talking about everything and nothing. The conversations weren't deep or profound, but they were real. It was during those walks that he realized how much he had been missing. He had been so focused on his responsibilities that he hadn't given himself the chance to connect with her in the way he now wanted to. One evening, as they walked through the park near their home, his daughter looked up at him and asked, "Do you think you'll play again like you did at school?" He paused, the question catching him off guard. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Maybe. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet." She grinned, nudging him with her elbow. "I think you should. You were amazing. Everyone loved it." He smiled, grateful for her encouragement, but something in her words made him stop and think. She was right. He had been amazing, not because he was the best pianist, but because he had stepped up. He had done something that scared him, and that in itself had made it worth it. He wasn't sure yet what that meant for his future, but he knew that he didn't want to let the feeling fade. He didn't want to just let it be a one-time thing. The next day, as he was cleaning the school halls, he overheard some teachers talking. They were discussing the upcoming school talent show, and one of them mentioned that they were looking for new acts. Without thinking, he found himself stepping into the conversation. "I'd be interested," he said before he could stop himself. "I could play something for the talent show." The teachers looked at him, surprised at first. Then they smiled. "That would be great. You should definitely sign up." One of them said in that moment, he felt a mix of excitement and dread. He had just committed himself to something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but there was no turning back now. The words were out, and deep down, part of him knew that this was another step in his journey, another way to prove to himself that he could do more than just survive. He could live. He could take chances and follow the music, even if it was terrifying. When he got home that night, he told his daughter about what had happened. "I signed up for the talent show," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Her eyes went wide with excitement. "That's awesome. You're going to do great." He wasn't so sure, but he smiled at her enthusiasm. "I hope so," he said quietly. Over the next few weeks, he practiced even more. He spent hours in the music room at school, playing the piano and refining his piece for the show. It wasn't just about playing anymore. It was about pushing himself further, about breaking down the walls he had built around himself. With every note, he was letting go of a little more of the fear and doubt that had held him back for so long. He had always told himself that there was no time for this, that there were too many other responsibilities. But now, as he practiced, he realized that those excuses didn't matter. Life was short. The music had always been there, waiting for him, and now it felt like it was finally his turn to answer. The talent show was just around the corner. The day before, he found himself sitting in his car in the school parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't felt this nervous in a long time. His mind was racing. What if he messed up? What if everyone was expecting something incredible and he let them down? What if the whole thing turned into a disaster? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He had faced worse situations in his life. This was just another challenge. He had practiced, he had prepared, and now all he had to do was show up and play. When he walked into the school that afternoon, the familiar hum of energy in the air made his nerves flare up again. Teachers and students were bustling about, getting ready for the event. There was laughter, there were last-minute preparations, and then there was him, standing at the edge of it all, feeling like an imposter. But just as he was about to turn, Around and slip away, he saw his daughter waiting by the entrance with a big smile on her face. "Are you ready, Dad?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. He nodded slowly, feeling a surge of determination. "I think I am." The talent show was held in the school's auditorium, a space filled with students and parents. The stage was simple, but the spotlight felt enormous. He had never performed in front of so many people before, not like this. As he walked backstage, he was greeted by a few of the teachers who were organizing the event. They smiled at him and wished him luck, their support evident in their words. Finally, it was his turn. He walked out onto the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. The spotlight was bright, almost blinding. He couldn't see anyone in the audience, just a blur of faces, but it didn't matter. He sat down at the piano and took a deep breath. For a moment, the noise and bustle of the world outside faded. There was only him and the piano. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling the cool, familiar surface beneath his fingers. The first few notes came out slowly, almost tentatively, but as the music began to fill the air, he felt something shift inside him. This was his moment. This was what he had worked for, what he had been scared of, but what he had needed to do. All along Dot, as the music grew, so did his confidence. He lost himself in the rhythm, in the flow of the piece. The nerves began to fade, replaced by the joy of simply playing. He wasn't thinking about the crowd, about expectations, or about what might go wrong. He was just playing. He was being himself. When the final note sounded, the auditorium was silent for a moment, and then the applause erupted. He looked up, and for the first time, he wasn't worried about what anyone thought. He had done it. He had played and in. Doing so, he had found a piece of himself that had been missing for far too long. Dot, as he stood up and left the stage, he felt a deep sense of pride. His daughter was waiting for him backstage, her face beaming. She hugged him tightly. "You were amazing, Dad. I knew you could do it." He smiled, a wave of emotion flooding over him. "Thanks, kiddo," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Thanks for believing in me." That night, as they walked home together, he realized something. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about impressing anyone or winning applause. It was about stepping out of the shadows and taking the chance to be who he really was. And in that moment, he knew he had taken a step toward a new chapter in his life, one where music, passion, and connection would always have a place. The weeks after the talent show were a blur of emotions. It was like something had shifted permanently inside him, a change he hadn't expected. He had always been the background figure, the one who worked behind the scenes, quietly making sure everything ran smoothly. But now he felt different. He felt seen, heard, and more alive than he had in a long time. Dot. It wasn't just the applause from the talent show, or the words of encouragement from his colleagues. It was something deeper, something that had been buried for years. The feeling of standing up on that stage, of letting his music fill the air, had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. It wasn't just about playing the piano anymore. It was about rediscovering a part of himself he had lost along the way. His daughter could see it too. She noticed how much more present he was, how he took the time to listen and engage with her. Their conversations were different now. They weren't just about the usual everyday stuff, school, homework, chores, but about the things that really mattered. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and what the future might hold. And he began to realize that while he had spent so many years focused on providing for her, it was moments like these that were the real treasures. The small, simple moments of connection. One evening, as they were sitting together on the couch, his daughter turned to him with a thoughtful look on her face. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think I want to learn how to play the piano too." He looked at her, surprised but happy. "Really?" That's great. I think you'd be really good at it. She smiled shyly. Do you think you could teach me? Like you taught yourself? He felt a warmth spread through him. The idea of passing on what he had rediscovered to her, of teaching her something that had meant so much to him, was both humbling and exciting. I'd love to, he said. We'll figure it out together. The next few weeks were spent with him teaching her the basics of the piano. He wasn't a professional teacher, but he had learned enough over the years to help her get started. They spent hours together, laughing when she made mistakes and celebrating the small victories. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. And it was special. He was no longer just the custodian who worked quietly in the background. He was a father, a mentor, and a person who had found the courage to embrace the things that brought him joy. He had rediscovered his love for music, and in doing so, he had opened up a whole new world for himself and for his daughter. One day, after a particularly good lesson, his daughter turned to him with a grin. You know, she said, maybe we could do a duet one day. You play the piano, and I'll sing. He chuckled, imagining the two of them performing together. It wasn't a bad idea. It was a crazy idea, but it was a good one. That sounds like a lot of fun, he said. Maybe one day we will. The idea of performing together excited him, but it also made him realize something important. There was no deadline for finding joy in the things you love. It wasn't about rushing to achieve something or trying to prove yourself to others. It was about enjoying the process, taking the time to learn and grow, and sharing that experience with the people you cared about. As the months went by, he continued to play whenever he could. He played at home, in the music room at school, and even in the quiet moments when no one else was around. The piano had become a part of his life in a way it never had before. It was no longer just a talent he kept hidden. It was a gift he was learning to share with the world. At work, things began to shift as well. His colleagues started to see him differently, not just as the custodian, but as someone who had something valuable to offer. Some of them even asked him to play at staff meetings or special events. It wasn't something he had expected, but it felt good to be appreciated in this way. It reminded him that everyone, no matter their job or role, had something special to contribute, but it wasn't about the attention. It wasn't about being praised or admired. It was about the personal satisfaction he felt when he played, the way the music allowed him to express emotions he couldn't always put into words. It was about finding a balance between his responsibilities and his passions, between being a provider and being someone who took care of his own needs as well. One afternoon, as he sat in the music room at school, playing a new piece he had been working on, the music teacher came in to check on him. She had been one of the first to encourage him after the staff event, and her support had meant a lot to him. You're getting really good, she said with a smile. You've come a long way since that first performance. He smiled, but there was a hint of modesty in his voice. I don't know about that. I'm just playing what feels right. She raised an eyebrow. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. I think you have a real gift. Have you thought about performing? Outside of the school? Maybe at a local event or something? He thought about it for a moment. It wasn't something he had seriously considered, but the idea of playing in front of a larger audience had a certain appeal. It wasn't about being famous or seeking approval. It was about pushing his limits, about sharing his passion with more people. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but the thought made his heart race with a mixture of excitement and fear. Maybe one day he would take that step. Maybe one day he would play for a crowd of strangers and let the music carry him through. For now, though, he was content with what he had. He had rediscovered his love for music, and he had shared it with the people who mattered most: his daughter, his colleagues, and himself. He had found a new sense of purpose, one that wasn't tied to his job or his role as a father. But to the things that made him feel alive, as he left the music room that afternoon, he thought about how far he had come. He had gone from being a man who kept his passion hidden to someone who embraced it fully. He had learned that it was never too late to follow your dreams, no matter how small or big they might seem. It wasn't about achieving some grand success. It was about finding joy in the journey, And with that thought, he smiled, knowing that the music would always be there for him. It was a part of him, and he would never let it go again.